Get on with it. See you later.
Thank you, Trev.
Thank you. Next is Matt Parry. He's worked within the youth service for around 25 years, as well as working on the youth and community professional development course at Cardiff Metropolitan University. So, to your screen now.
Good morning, all. How are we doing? Let's see if I can share. Good to see some names I remember from previous lives. As just been said, my name is Matt Parry, and I used to work for Cardiff Youth Service for very many years, and delivering and managing some of the street-based work was part of my responsibilities. I'm not going to be speaking to you philosophically. That's Graham's bag, and obviously he's an expert in that. What I've been asked to do is just share some stories from around Wales. Working for Youth Cymru, I've been able to speak to workers across Wales, find out their experiences of COVID and some of the things that Graham has touched on already. I'm just waiting for technology to work, hopefully.
Yeah, we can see your presentation.
Is that there now?
Yeah, good.
Great. So I'm going to do a little bit of shameless plug-in of the organisation I'm currently working for, just because I can, really. So as I said, my current grant title is Youth Work Researcher and Coordinator. I'm only on a temporary contract with Youth Cymru currently, which is up until the end of this financial year, and I'm working on a couple of projects across Wales, as I said, that use detached approaches, outreach approaches, digital approaches to maintain engagement with young people. So the organisation itself is a major youth work charity, as we say, working pan Wales. Some of you who have been around long enough will know it as the old WAYC, the Welsh Association of Youth Clubs, and that means that we've been serving young people in Wales as an organisation for around about 83 years. And one of our key principles of what we do is to work collaboratively with members. So we have several hundred members of the organisation who we work with on joint funding bids, on joint delivery, and we look to be as unique and innovative, it's easy for me to say, innovative, okay, still can't say it, you know what I mean, and provide young people with projects, programs, that contribute to what we say, the bettering of their lives. And again, I'm always interested in sort of looking at what that means for young people and what that means for us in terms of outcomes. So just a very few examples of some of the stuff that we're doing. We're just coming to the end of a Youth Endowment Fund project. Some of you may have heard of that, and they're just in April this year reopening a series of funding bids. So again, I would urge people to look at that in terms of bringing work and money into Wales and looking at delivery of youth work. They are looking at the criminal justice world, the youth justice world, and again, following on from some of Graham's comments around some of maybe the tensions around our value base and where we see ourselves sitting in that, I think will be an interesting discussion for the forum and for youth work in Wales generally. We're getting into the digital world, as some of you will know, through our youth pods. Again, these are podcasts using the old-fashioned terms for young people by young people, and highlighting a range of issues from mental health to money issues, budgeting issues, financial literacy, that digital industry and the digital world, and also energy saving techniques, etc. for young people to help them with their independent living, and the transitions that they're going through as they grow older. And as Graham says, we've been fortunate in Wales that Qualifications Wales are consulting in a really innovative, can I say that word today, really good way, and it's a real genuine consultation that's happening at the moment. The Qualifications Wales are really interesting to hear the views of young people, either in the current education system, doesn't necessarily mean at school, and those who have experienced it previously, So that could be youth workers, teachers, older young people, etc. So really help them understand where qualifications are going from 2027. So the reason I'm referring to that is, as Youth Cymru, we are offering support for youth groups to come out and take young people through the consultation process. It's a bit of a dry process, I'm sure that they will forgive me for saying. So we're looking to offer support to organisations, especially if organisations have contact with young people who may be, harder to reach, and I really don't like that term, but, who are maybe on the fringes of education, who would like to have their voices heard about their experiences of education, both positive and negative. Please get in touch. We'd be really glad to come along and help you. As Graham says also, it will be through the digital means. We prefer to do it face to face with young people. We'll make it as interactive and as fun as we can and engaging as we can. But there's an open offer there to come out, support the young people that you're working with if they have an interest in participating in that consultation to shape the future of the curriculum in Wales, as I said, going forward, and looking specifically at GCSEs. Okay, one of the other functions of Youth Cymru is that we offer a range of training courses. This is just a sample of them. We hope that they match the emerging needs of the sector and of youth workers. So you can see there that I'm currently delivering several detached and outreach work, Agorad Cymru level 3 qualifications, and that's been really interesting, again, to get exposure to colleagues, to hear about the issues that they're facing and the positive nature of the work that's happening across Wales. We've also got courses around safeguarding, the emerging digital work in those spaces and places, as it's called. All of these are accredited and you can access. Some of them are free, some of them are not. So please have a look at the website, and I'll put the link up momentarily. But if there are areas or gaps within Wales, within your practice, that you think there should be or could be some training, and you think Youth Cymru could have a role in that, again, please get in touch. I'm always keen to ensure that the training that youth workers generally are offered, is fit for purpose, and, as I say, is meeting those emerging issues faced by young people. We also offer a range of young people's training, and we have Cyflwyniad, which is our sort of youth forum, our youth participatory function within the organisation, and with the vote at 16, we are engaging politicians around their policies, their manifestos, etc., in the run-up to those elections. So yeah, just to reiterate that message in the chat, if people can join the conversation on Twitter, that would be appreciated. Oh, I seem to have frozen. I'm just waiting for the things to move on, so I'll carry on. So I just want to assure you, really, colleagues, that I'm not here considering myself an expert, or I'm not here to sell anything other than my organisation, as I've just done. I do have several years' experience in the sector and the privilege of meeting a lot of youth workers across Wales. So my intention today is to share some of those reflections, really, and how they can inform the work of the forum. Through those conversations and the concerns that have been raised, but also the good practice, not best practice, that's been highlighted to me throughout Wales. Excuse me. And those colleagues who are here today will know that I tend towards, that purist sense of youth work, and this can sometimes lead me to be a little bit critically reflective, and maybe too critically reflective and provocative sometimes. So I guess at this point, it's probably a good time to say that any views that I express today are not necessarily those of my organisation, especially if I get myself into trouble, which is always a possibility. I do say I was quite surprised that I was given the opportunity to have a platform that was one way in the main. But again, I do welcome any challenge to anything that I say, any questions. I know there's time at the end. I will get us on track for the lunch break, probably maybe even finish a little bit earlier if possible. So yeah, I'm not intending to preach to the converted. I know, looking at the attendees list today, that there's a lot of people on here with a lot more experience and a lot more knowledge, certainly in detached and outreach work. But again, I just want to look at offering some food for thought, probably posing more questions than I will answers. In a relatively uncertain, unknown period of hopefully post-lockdown, and how that affects detached outreach, mobile provision, etc. As we're going into that phase, for me, it raises some of the age-old questions in the debates about the youth work sector here in Wales, about the skills, the knowledge, the relationships, and the nature of all of that we have to facilitate, to offer, to be able to support young people in the best way we can through this transition to this new normal, which Graham has also talked about. And I don't think any of us really at this stage know what that looks like. So that makes sort of planning quite difficult. Again, I would reinforce that principle about where are we placing young people's voice in that thinking from now, from this point, if we're not doing so already. How can we continually do that to make sure that we're informed, that we're co-producing with young people, the opportunities and the offer that youth workers and youth services are planning on providing. And as Graham says, it's about respecting those lived experiences of those young people, in terms of their experiences in the last 12 months and also beyond, to shape what has potentially been a monolithical approach to youth service provision in Wales. Is it a case of we're doing what we've always done? How do we know that works? When do we step outside of it to reflect on it, to monitor it, to evaluate it, as we've heard? Is this an opportunity, a pertinent opportunity, to be able to refresh, reset all the buzzwords, youth work delivery in Wales currently, and obviously locally for yourselves? I just think, as many of you will agree, if not all of you, that the global pandemic and the subsequent restrictions has brought traditional youth services to a close, so centre-based in the main, and brought those community-based, street-based interventions back into people's consciousness and in vogue, really, I think, across the sector. Because it was one of the ways, before we went into level 4, that we were still able to go out and engage young people, as well as other methods, including digital, as we know. And as Graham mentioned, and with the weekend's events coming up, I'll probably get shot down for this. It's the wrong shaped ball for me. But I think in Wales, we do have to look across the border and recognise that the MYA, with a legal backing and with a lot of hard work, did establish the status of youth workers as critical workers and gave clear guidance on how they were able to continue practicing on the streets. We did that in Wales as well. We are recognised as youth workers, as critical workers. But I wonder whether, again, food for thought for the forum, whether or not we can campaign to get some more clarity on that. We assume, and I think it is an assumption at the moment, that we are starting to come out of lockdown. And if that's the case, how do we do that? But are we also planning, for maybe not coming out as quickly as others, or maybe not coming out at all? And where do we see the place of detached youth work within that? How are we informing our decision makers locally and nationally around the value of detached work and the work on the street, and continuing to engage with young people? Because for me, it'd be interesting to explore with young people, again, as Graham has already mentioned, whether the restrictions have affected the constancy of our work, the nature of it, Has it changed from a purist point of view, or from what is widely understood to be the values of detached youth work? And has it had a detrimental effect on the relationships in communities? So has the change in nature of what we can do socially distanced, physically distanced from young people, impacted our relationships with them? So I'm reminded of a conversation I had recently about delivering the C-card scheme, the condom distribution scheme on the street, and the difficulties that some detached youth workers faced around maintaining dignity and confidentiality of the young person whilst undertaking an assessment and having that discussion about healthy relationships. You know, although they moved to the side away from other groups, you know, it was still in a public arena, quite a loud conversation to be able to hear each other at distance. So I wonder, you know, again, thinking about the experience of young people, what they think about the distance, not the social distance or physical distance, but the distance that has maybe emerged between us as street-based detached youth workers and them in their places and their spaces. One of the positives that we always celebrate is that we hope that our work is non-judgmental and it's based on trusted relationships with young people. I think there's an opportunity to explore some of that as well. But has the lockdown and the approaches that we've taken during lockdown served to maybe look at young people in that deficit model approach around being a problem in our communities? Again, as Graham mentioned, you know, I'm looking at local forums on Facebook, and there's usually 2, 3, maybe 5 a day saying, why are young people out? I've just walked past the skate park and there's 20 young people. You know, their parents are neglectful, young people should be in. And that demonizing of young people in spaces because of the pandemic seems to be apparent in some areas. And that may be because young people are just fed up. You know, we talk often about digital fatigue and young people learning online, and then often, not always, but often the youth work offer is also online, and young people, you know, are growing tired of it. It's obviously not the same experience as being face to face in a room with a youth worker. And I just wonder again how we're going to support young people, how we're going to find out, as Graham says, about their experiences of the past, so we can inform what we do going forward. And again, workers have spoken to me about the tension and the conflict with their values, their professional values, about that stay-at-home message, and being asked to provide that on the streets as street-based youth workers. You know, and young people have fed back that they now start to see young people in the same bracket as the enforcers, whether that's the law enforcers or COVID enforcers, you know, and the relationship has suffered as a result. So I wonder again, you know, where that is happening in our communities, what are going to be our strategies to try and rebuild, in some cases, these relationships, and some of them at that established level with young people, where that distrust, mistrust has started to seep into the relationship because of the paranoia of the pandemic, because of the approach around distance and keeping away from each other. How can we re-engage in those relationships effectively going forward? As I did say, there are going to be more questions than there are answers, you know, coming from me. And I wondered if that's put us back as a profession, a youth work profession, and whether it's put the value of street-based work, detached work, back in young people's eyes, in the eyes of partners, and the eyes of the communities that we're working in. And again, if it has, you know, how can we recognise that, and what are our strategies to start rebuilding? One of the counter narratives, if you like, to that is, again, the assumption that the home is the safe place for young people. And talking to youth workers and young people last week, one of the challenges has been around engaging young people at a time when they need to get out of the house for a whole variety of reasons, and then they don't want to engage digitally because they don't want people seeing into their home and their home life, and they're becoming further and further sort of pushed to the fringes of our delivery as youth workers in Wales. And again, how are we looking to be best serving those young people? How do we identify them through our mapping, through our reconnaissance work, etc.? You know, how do we know where they are, and what can we do about it? However, I'm not going to be all cynical and negative. One of the real positives in that same vein, I think, that detached outreach work has been able to provide during this time is to have eyes on young people. And I need to clarify that I don't mean from a surveillance point of view, you know, that watching, that coercion kind of thing, you know, that we are looking out for young people, that we are checking on the welfare of young people, that young people know when and where we're going to be in communities, so they can check in with us, and we can make sure that, okay, they're getting the support that they need. At a very base level, I think that's been a real positive through the pandemic. And I know, again, maybe controversially, that there are some frustrations with youth workers who have not been able to do that because their organisation has made that decision. And again, I'm not criticising that. That's for all the right reasons in terms of government advice, etc. But in Wales, I think we do have a mismatch of provision across the Principality where, you know, some local authorities are out and then the neighbouring one won't be. Some third sector organisations are out and others aren't. You know, there isn't that consistency. And again, I think this could be an area that the forum could support the sector in looking to establish, you know, maybe reassuring decision makers, funders, etc., that we may be able to operate safely and still provide provision and support to young people within the context and restrictions of the pandemic. Because we do know that there are other influences in the community, and we do know that those influences can often be negative, and they can influence young people into maybe risk-taking behaviours. So I'm still thinking, you know, involvement in county lines, criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation. You know, we know this stuff is going on in our communities, and we know that there are people actively out there recruiting young people to these agendas. And one of my passions around detached work is being there as that sounding board for young people. You know, we've got hopefully that established relationship where they can come to us to ask, to clarify their thinking around, you know, things that they may be getting involved in or thinking of getting involved in. You know, they may have anxieties and concerns about some of that, you know, if they're being coerced into it, manipulated and forced into some negative relationships, negative behaviours example. And for me, that's always been a strength of that detached worker, is that, you know, as we've said, they are detached from institutions. That can often generate a sense of trust within young people, that, you know, the worker isn't going to go back and tell an institution about the conversations. And I think it really puts us as detached youth workers on the front line, you know, at the coalface and all those other buzzwords, you know, to be able to identify these issues that young people are experiencing. And we talked about lived experience is, you know, in the past, but also in the present, you know, and potentially in the future. How can we help young people understand some of the influences that may be, you know, coming into their worlds? And you're going to hear from other people this afternoon, Nick, etc., about some of the work that they're doing in communities and at strategic level to identify and support young people with some of those vulnerabilities. I just wanted to allude to some data that the Sidestep project, which is an Action for Children project, and I know there's some colleagues here today, and thank you for providing this. We were just talking generally about, you know, the issues that the cohort of young people that they engage, who you could argue, you know, have a series of vulnerabilities and are at most at risk of entering the criminal justice system if they're not already, and having these negative influences affect their lives that I've talked about. And you can see there some of the emerging issues and some of the issues that young people are facing around substance misuse and the dealing and distribution of substances, possession of weapons, aggression and violence incidences. These are the issues that young people are involved in that will also affect communities. So I just wanted to highlight that. I don't know enough about the data to analyze it or anything else, but I just wanted to show that, you know, obviously there are many other organisations doing really good work as well. But I had a conversation with Gary last week, and I just thought it was pertinent, really, just to reflect on some of the issues that young people are facing in communities. What was really encouraging, I think, about today's event is this commitment. The data, sorry, has come from Action for Children, the Sidestep project, and their cohort of young people. I don't know if anybody from Sidestep, we didn't rehearse this bit, wants to answer that question about where the data has come from. Maybe pop something in the chat just to clarify. As I said, I'm not in a position to analyse it or comment on it. I just thought it was an interesting indicator of some of the issues, some of the vulnerabilities affecting young people in the community today. So as I said, one of the real positives is about resurrecting, because there has been attempts in the past to bring together a forum of like-minded professionals, detached street-based workers, and I think there's a real powerfulness around being able to secure the work going forward into the future. If we can come together effectively and really reinforce the value of and the values of detached work, street-based work, again, you know, locally and nationally, we can hopefully secure that as a recognised, effective approach to delivering youth work across the Principality. Because we know, you know, in the last 10 years, just looking back momentarily, that, you know, budget cuts, etc., have affected our ability to work and to provide, thanks, Gary, and to provide services as much as we'd like to in communities. So I just tried to bring together.
Give me 2 minutes.
Sorry, was that somebody trying to speak? No?
I'm not sure, Matt, sorry.
That's okay, no, sorry. Just wanted to obviously give space if somebody did want to speak. So I thought I'd just couch that really in just the views and the conversations I've had across Wales as some potential areas for the forum to consider. And as it goes, they've all come out mainly as sort of starting with the letter C. So I would ask the forum to consider the commitment. You know, how are organisations committed to detached and street-based work? Have we, during the last 12 months or maybe longer, stopped talking about youth work and the value of youth work and youth work values in our team meetings, in our supervisions? How are we reinforcing those values and the value of the work? Because I believe, and it's a personal opinion, that we need to understand the impact, the value of the work, our role, our place within that work, to then be able to sell it to others. So local elected members, decision makers, funders, senior leaders within organisations, etc. Is it rooted in the plans, often called the sort of the golden thread of organisations, you know, the strategic plans, the operational plans within the organisation? Is there a firm commitment written down to giving youth workers the space to operate in those uncertain spaces with young people? is there a commitment to give youth workers, detached youth workers, time to be able to do that, and a commitment to relaxing the predetermined outcomes that may be associated with some of the work currently. I think we also need to consider whether some of the delivery was a stopgap to respond to the pandemic. Is there a cheaper alternative to, opening centres 5 nights a week? And what's the impact on that in terms of budgets going forward? Is there an opportunity to secure the work in that way? And as I said earlier, some of the models of delivery may be quite antiquated in certain areas in Wales. It's what we've always done. And there's a potential now, a real opportunity to sort of defrost the current models, if you like, reshape them and then refreeze them. Again, some of you will know because you're doing that. Do we need to seek permission as detached and outreach workers, street-based workers, to achieve all those things, to be able to have the time, let young people set the agenda? Do we have the permission, in inverted commas, I'm not sure from who, starting with young people, definitely, but do we have the permission to operate in that power dynamic where young people are setting the pace of the relationship, they're setting the agenda? Or are we going to go back to, models that maybe already go out with a preset agenda around maybe antisocial behaviour, etc., hotspots and these kinds of issues? And for me, there's a real question about competence. One of the stark things that have been fed back through my conversations is around youth workers who have maybe been centre-based workers for 20 years, for example, who've been asked to operate in a detached street-based outreach setting, and they don't feel that they're competent. They don't feel confident enough to be able to operate in those spaces. And again, just consider whether or not we're diluting the concept of street-based and outreach work around making the assumptions that anybody can do it. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to youth workers. The people I've been talking to are excellent youth workers, and have real strong relationships with young people, but it just doesn't suit their personality, their delivery style, working on the street. And as I've said to them, that's absolutely fine. That's okay, because we've all got a place within the youth work offer, in my opinion. And that maybe opens a bit of a provocation from me in terms of who else is delivering the work in our communities, who else are maybe alluding to themselves or maybe calling themselves detached youth workers, and how do we feel about that? Are they engaged with others, maybe with the experience and the knowledge in communities? And again, I think, as I think Graham said, in England, again, part of being recognised as that critical key worker status was around either obtaining or working towards a JNC qualification. So it just placed youth work in that professional arena that actually, whilst, and I use this term with the greatest of respect, well-meaning amateurs in our communities are doing good work, it recognises the position and the status of youth work in a response within our communities to the pandemic. As I said, that might be controversial, and I'm certainly not saying that those organisations and individuals are not doing great work, but it's just about the identity for me of street-based work, detached work in our communities. Hopefully, working with the statutory sector and the voluntary sector, the forum can offer some clarity and work with, the Welsh Local Government Association, and others, to be able to look at how we can legitimately place ourselves, at the forefront of maybe a continuing response, or as a major player in coming out of lockdown and lockdown restrictions. The next one was about capability and capacity. You know, it's about that situation analysis of organisations, considering where they are in terms of resources, what they've got available, the environments that they're working in, and really going back to basics about considering the rationale for the work from the organisation. And then obviously along with that comes resourcing, because it needs to be resourced effectively and appropriately to be able to do that. Do we have the right workers in the right roles? You know, how are our recruitment processes? Are we attracting the right people to our roles? Is detached street-based work an attractive proposition to newly qualified youth workers, to well-established youth workers? If not, why not? You know, where can we find that out? Where can we challenge our assumptions that as long as you're a youth worker, you can provide any approach to youth work? Again, that's probably me being a little bit controversial. We do know that obviously youth workers have a contribution, and we do know that it was on all hands to the pump approach during the pandemic, and I'm not decrying that, and I want to be really clear on that. We knew that everybody, you know, with centres closing, from a very base point of view, that organisations had to keep their workers in work, and obviously we support that. And we didn't have a great deal of time to maybe respond, and it was maybe a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic and getting out there. Again, I would say in terms of recruitment and the delivery of work in organisations, is there an opportunity to revisit that motivation, the passion, the skill sets of youth workers, maybe offer youth workers who've had a taste of street-based work, you know, the opportunity to progress within that and actually maybe even specialise in it, dare I say. And again, some people may not like that terminology around specialising within youth work, but I often think it's quite interesting and useful, you know, using people's skill sets, their experience, and, you know, what they bring to youth work in the best way should be at the forefront of what we're doing. And then the next thing was around a campaign for reinvestment. We know the pandemic is going to cost billions. We know there's local authority cuts in the pipeline, but there's also opportunities, as I've mentioned earlier, with the Youth Endowment Fund and the Safer Streets Fund, you know, to attract further external funding or further funding depending on how we're funded. Are we going to reinvest the time and the commitment to reprofiling our communities? Again, as Graham has mentioned, you know, what credence do we give to primary and secondary data sources at the moment? You know, how are we using data and statistics? How are we using community intelligence and the intelligence gathered by other agencies? And that does include, you know, the police, because that can give us an indication of where perceived or real issues are of antisocial behaviour. And if we triangulate that, that might tell us where young people are and hanging out, what spaces and places they're occupying in our communities, at a very bare minimum, potentially. And again, if you don't agree with me, please say so. You know, how are we sure that the groups that we're working with, the individuals that we're working with in our communities represent that community? You know, if we're looking at inequalities, as we should be as dedicated youth workers, you know, how do we know? How do we know who we're engaging? And that may be a point that Laura made earlier about data collection, but for me, more importantly, about who we're not engaging and what are our strategies to look at some of that. Part of that might be the analysis of whether groups have disappeared from our communities. So somebody mentioned earlier about young people's anxieties about not coming out of the house. You know, have they disappeared from their traditional spaces and places? Can we take that a step forward and create safe spaces within our communities? And again, there are models elsewhere that can show us and inform us how to do this. You know, is it beyond the realms of possibilities to have dedicated spaces in communities where young people can have Wi-Fi? It's adequately lit. There isn't dog poo and litter everywhere. It's a respected space as a space for young people. And that's quite an exciting prospect, I think, for the sector in Wales. And at the heart of all of this has to be that co-production, has to be that ongoing voice of young people, shaping, informing, and enabling us to provide the best services that we can. So then I went on to sort of just consider, I'm conscious of time, consider some of the potential challenges. And one of the themes that was coming through from colleagues across Wales was whether there was a need to reintegrate young people back into communities. Will there be tensions within reclaiming some of those spaces? So have young people taken over traditionally adult and toddler spaces like play parks, etc.? Have adults taken over traditional young people spaces in the last months of lockdown? You know, are there going to be tensions within communities around reclaiming some of those spaces? And as Graham mentioned earlier, you know, being available, being there, working in that uncertainty of practice, having the commitment of time and support from our organisations to be able to work with young people on what I would assume it will be a potentially slower process to be able to bring that sense of community for young people back, which then knock on to that wider sense of community. And we'll do all the things that we always do, that informal education stuff, you know, that's already been mentioned this morning. And again, it's how do we articulate this to decision makers, to funders, to give us that space, to give us that opportunity to reclaim these spaces, to reintegrate communities. I've talked about reshaping and refreezing. You know, and again, on how we need to involve young people in that. How will services, are we already starting to think about how services will look coming out of lockdown? Are we finding ourselves maybe defaulting back to the way we've always done things? You know, are we able to challenge ourselves and others around this concept of contemporary youth work and what that needs to look like? You know, what are the emerging issues, as I've alluded to, for young people coming out of lockdown? Are we treating them as experts in their own lives? Are we affording them that opportunity to share with us their lived experiences and treating them as experts to help us deliver the best youth work that we can? Again, you know, the potential for the rise in issues such as the toxic trio and domestic violence, mental ill health and substance misuse, as I've alluded to, you know, and all these other vulnerabilities that young people will be presenting in the streets, on the streets, in our youth centres, etc. How prepared are we for that? Are we starting to get ready for that now, if we can? And again, that may look at some processes of realignment of funding. It may look at some difficult decisions around what youth services fund. You know, it may look at our own sense of our integrity and whether we've compromised any of that in the past to meet other people's agendas, other people's outcomes. One of my provocation questions to you as a forum, as a sector, would be, do people think that we have lost our faith in our ability to wash our own face in these partnerships arenas? You know, do we stand up for youth work as a principled and conceptual contribution in our communities? And I think that's a really interesting question, you know, or have we merely become a gateway for others to deliver their agendas through our work, through our delivery approaches? Again, quite controversial, but I think pertinent. And then just to conclude on this, there may be some sense of retreating. You know, young people may have got used to having youth workers on the street where they were not before the pandemic, and decisions may be made where those services are going to be withdrawn. And again, it'd be interesting to see whether we're thinking about how we're legacy planning with communities, for communities, with young people, for young people, for those areas that won't be served necessarily by street-based work going forward. So as Graham mentioned earlier and others, I really like this quote about not silencing the enriched outcomes of youth work. We need to have a commitment as a sector to giving it a voice. If we're able to capture what we often will see as the everyday ordinary and the remarkable youth work, because that's often what is happening in a street-based setting, and we can sympathetically demonstrate the value, as has been mentioned several times this morning, of our practice, and developing young people as critical thinkers about the impact of our practice on them and the impact of their lived experience on them and on others and the situation that they find themselves within the community, I believe will strengthen the detached sector and really reinforce our values, highlight our values, and building a megaphone we should shout from the rooftops about actually the successes that youth workers have achieved, certainly in the last 12 months, but also our intentions to achieve going forward. So my last message to you is to keep calm and do youth work. You know, and I would say that I've had the privilege, and it is a privilege through conversations with colleagues across Wales, to see the passion, the dedication and the desire to deliver quality street-based youth work. And for me, I would leave you really with this thought. Is it about one day that we might get to a place where we can support that and achieve that within our work and our organisations? Or can this be day one of us beginning to campaign and to challenge and to create those opportunities to really highlight and celebrate the value and the place of detached youth work in the youth work sector in Wales? That's it from me. Thank you very much. I think we've got a couple of minutes before lunch. I'm always happy, as I said, to take any challenge or to take any questions. I can't promise I'll answer them, but you know, over to you. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate you've been sat for a long time in front of a screen when we're talking about digital fatigue, and I wish you the very best going forward with the forum. And if there's anything I can do to help, I'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you all.
Thank you for that, Matt. That was really good. Does anyone have any questions before lunch?
Only quickly. So there's some interesting points that Mark brought up there, and I think there was a lot of misinformation for young people when we first started out, when they were told, you know, they were not going to be carriers and they were not going to be affected by COVID, and trying to break that's not their, that wasn't their fault then. So then they were starting to interact together, and that's really complex. Like I said, they thought they weren't going to be affected, and then the next minute they was. But then the other thing that I'm really conscious of as well is there's going to be pots of money. Really interested in Matt and both talked about, is then we don't be guilty of chasing pots of money here to say we can do a job that's not youth work values. We have to listen to what we do, and we have to be true to ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to go back down to the decimated route of not delivering what real is. That is it.
Thank you. You're welcome to leave your cameras or leave the chat, and you're welcome to join back. We're joining back at 12:45 for Nick Olsen. So thank you for that, and Graham this morning. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
I'll just make a quick comment.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. It's great. You know, it's very rich, detailed. I think there's my comments really about how many of the things that you said they're actually connected, I think, and the best example of this is, as you said, the challenge of partnership work. And I think that that's very much connected to your point about articulation. Because, of course, one of the realities of sitting around a table, whether in practice or online, is that there's a world of competing understandings of what detached youth work is. So, of course, in order for partnership work to work well, we have to be able to articulate what it is within those kinds of contexts. And I remember it's a few years ago now when I wrote a book about detached youth work, and I said that very often detached youth workers are minority partners. So I sort of problematise the idea of partnership, because what tended to happen is people looked at the detached youth workers and said, you're in partnership with us, so you will do this, which seemed to contradict the very idea of partnership. Just quickly, a follow-up point is about, again, I do think it's a kind of conceptual problem. So, we will be invited to work on issues around safer streets and serious violence and all that kind of stuff. But it matters to me greatly how we understand the words. Now, as far as I can work out, the kind of experience of poverty that many communities are experiencing, that's a form of violence. That's a form of violence. So we've got to push back a little bit at the very narrow interpretations some people have of what detached youth work is, and indeed of what violence might be as well. Thank you. Good job, mate.
That was good. Hey, Mike, can you stop sharing your thing, and we can put the slide up? That's all next.